On top of the regular franchise rankings I've been putting out lately, I've also been wanting to do some director rankings where I'll take a look through a certain filmmaker's catalogue and put them in a list for your consumption. And what better place to start with than the film bro's wet dream himself, Christopher Nolan. The man's been working hard at it now for over 20 years and has made some of the most exciting blockbusters in recent memory. So with his latest film Oppenheimer coming out earlier this year, what better time than now to go through his filmography? I'll be trying my best to keep this video spoiler free, so if you haven't seen any of these, you should be safe. And with that in mind, here is my list of every Christopher Nolan film ranked from worst to best. Tenet is the only film on this list that I'd consider a bad movie. Don't get me wrong, it's still really well made and is clearly a pretty impressive technical achievement, but as a finished product, I don't think it works. The film is about a former CIA agent who's recruited into a secret organization and tasked with finding the origin of certain objects that are traveling backwards through time and how they're related to an attack from the future. It's a super cool premise, and I love when Nolan gets involved with time shenanigans, but I think where Tenet failed is that it relied on its premise too much. Despite some pretty striking visuals and set pieces, there just isn't much to connect to here. The plot is really difficult to follow, and not because the story itself is complicated, but because of the way that the film communicates it to the viewer. It's constantly jumping around back and forth, making it a chore to work out what the hell is going on. I'm pretty sure that even parts you are able to make out are littered with plot holes and contrivances that don't make an awful lot of sense. The characters don't have much personality to them, and with the exception of Kenneth Branagh's Andre Sator, I don't really remember anything about them. They serve mostly as vessels to deliver the action set pieces and aren't too prioritized with making any decisions that feel like something real people would do. I think it's important to remember that this came out in 2020 and was the first film I saw in theaters after the whole COVID-19 lockdown, which only served to disappoint me further. I was so excited to see the new Christopher Nolan film after not being able to go to the cinema for months, and the film was not that good. I really enjoyed some of the concepts, and the novelty of watching bullets flying and explosions blasting in reverse was really cool, but Tenet overall was a film that just had no heart to me. So I'm going to come right out and say that I'm just not a big fan of war movies. I don't really know why, I just find it hard to get invested in them because I feel like I've seen all of this before. But as a fan of Nolan's work, I kind of had to check Dunkirk out, and it didn't really do a lot to change my mind. Don't get me wrong, the film is obviously super well made from a technical standpoint, it looks and sounds fantastic, but I found it hard to care about the people I was watching. It's as if Nolan wanted to make this less of a character piece and more of a day-in-the-life kind of thing, which I suppose he succeeded at, but it results in a movie where there's nothing for me to latch onto. I'm not gonna lie, I was a little bored for the first 40 minutes of this thing. I had no attachment to any of the characters, and I felt like I was watching the same set pieces play out over and over again. The movie is kind of split into 4 sections: the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the civilians. I thought this was a really cool idea, where most movies would only focus on one. We had a bit of each of them. But sadly, the only one that I can say I was actually invested in was the civilians on the boat. However, by the time it ended, I think I came to appreciate what Nolan was going for. The fact that you never see a single German soldier in the movie fully cements that it's not about fighting, it's about how all the different factions of the UK came together to support each other. I eventually grew to appreciate all the sections of the film, except for Tom Hardy's Air Force sequences. They felt a little dull to me and didn't seem to have the same sense of urgency as the other sections. I can certainly appreciate the direction and cinematography, as well as Hans Zimmer's score, but all of these great pieces just don't come together as well as they could have for me. The best way I can describe it is that after walking away from the thing, I feel more positive about the film than I do when I'm actually watching it. I love the messaging and the themes, but not necessarily the movie. The final chapter of his Batman trilogy, The Dark Knight Rises seems to be one of Nolan's most divisive films. There are people that love this movie, and there were people who were wildly disappointed with it. I find myself somewhere in the middle. I know its placement on this list looks like I don't like it that much, but I do actually get a kick out of it. I just enjoy the other movies here a little more. This is where I'd say that the films start becoming good. I think it's a really interesting place to start this movie, where Bruce Wayne has long given up the cape and become a recluse. Despite jumping ahead several years, it follows on from The Dark Knight really well, and enforces that the events of that film had consequences for all the characters involved. I like Anne Hathaway in the role of Catwoman, she does a pretty good job, and I love Tom Hardy as Bane. Sure, he's not quite as compelling as the Joker was, but I think it was the right choice to go somewhere completely different with the villain in this one. He's less chaotic and more calculated than his predecessor, and is actually a stronger fighter than Batman himself, which makes the action sequences a little more tense because you know that he's capable of totally breaking our hero. I actually enjoy the whole underground prison subplot and really like the idea of escape being thought of as impossible unless you scale the wall and make the jump without fear. I'm not too sure about the magic brace that can repair broken cartilage, that was maybe a little contrived, and how Bruce is able to travel thousands of miles as quickly as he does. I'm also not a fan of the twist reveal in the climax, it just doesn't feel earned to me. That being said, I enjoy the final showdown between Batman and Bane, and the actual end of the movie hits all the right beats for me. It feels like a definitive end to the story, and leaves on a nice note that can be left to the viewer's interpretation, but also feels totally conclusive. I like The Dark Knight Rises, but it's not without its flaws. So this was a movie that I wasn't particularly excited to see at first, but I felt an obligation as a Nolan fan to check out his first feature film. It was something I knew I had to get around to at some point, but oh boy am I glad I did. Following is about a young man who's developed a habit of following people around town to see what they do with their lives, and one day he's confronted by a man he was tailing and is introduced to the criminal underworld. The two begin burgling people's homes, not for financial gain, but for the satisfaction that they're violating people's possessions and privacy. This was probably one of the most tightly written screenplays I'd seen at the time of watching. The movie is only an hour and 9 minutes long, and every scene manages to progress the plot without the whole thing feeling like a non-stop thrill ride. It's actually kind of the perfect length, as I think much more and it would have overstayed its welcome. I understand that the short runtime was mostly due to the shoestring budget of £6,000, but Nolan managed to make this movie work exceptionally well for what he had at his disposal. Even the choice to film in black and white was a financial one, but it actually ends up adding to the neo-noir vibe he was going for. I do like the concept of showing us the story out of order as well. It allows us to piece the story together ourselves while withholding certain information to keep the mystery afloat. However, as much as I like it, I don't think it's quite as effective as it would be in his later work. Where films like Memento or Inception also play with time, they also establish the rules of how the movie is going to use it. In those films, it becomes a way of keeping the audience in the same seat as the protagonist, where here it comes across as more of a gimmick. If you're not paying attention, it's quite easy to get lost in the mess of a timeline. I like Following a lot. It's impressive for what it is, but it's also the product of a director who hasn't quite honed his craft yet. Out of all of Christopher Nolan's films, this is the one that feels the least Nolan-y. I do wonder if that's got something to do with the fact that to this day, it's the only one of his films he didn't write. It's a remake of a Norwegian film from the 90s and is about a detective who travels to Alaska to investigate a murder case, but his mental state starts to deteriorate when he can't get any sleep. He ends up accidentally shooting and killing his partner, with the only witness being the murderer he was chasing in the first place. So Insomnia ends up being a sort of psychological cat and mouse between these two people who don't like each other, but may have to work together to avoid getting caught. I love the concept of following a bad cop who thinks he's the good guy. It's a really interesting theme that the film chooses to explore that I hadn't really seen before. Al Pacino's performance was great at portraying all those subtle character motivations combined with the sleepless nights that he has to face. Robin Williams is also pretty good at playing a similar character on the other side of the law. I never really understood the world's fascination with his comedy stuff. I don't think his movies are that funny, but whenever he takes a serious dramatic role, he's often the best part of those projects. I think a character like this is so against type for someone like him that you have an odd sense of comfort around him despite knowing what he's capable of, which only makes him all the more intimidating. Like I said, I'm not sure if Nolan not writing this one had anything to do with it, but the film just doesn't have that stamp that you'd expect from one of his projects. That's not to say that it's bad, it's actually quite good, but the movie does feel like it's missing something. It's kind of hard to explain, but all the pieces here are great, there's not much to complain about, but as an overall piece of work, the film leaves me not feeling very much. I'd say that Insomnia is a good movie, but not a great movie. I don't think it can be stated just how important Batman Begins was for superhero cinema. Not only did it bring the Caped Crusader back from the ashes after 1997's Batman and Robin, but it kickstarted Hollywood's obsession with making comic book movies gritty and realistic. And as we all know, many of those movies that came in the aftermath of this one weren't very good, because I think that this film was a product of having the right director with the right cast at the right time. It was a massive gamble that paid off because of how much of a novelty it was upon release. It was a rare thing at the time to have a superhero story not really be about the superhero. This isn't a film about Batman, it's a film about Bruce Wayne and the events that led him to donning the mask. It's patient and takes its time getting to where it needs to go. It respects the audience enough to think, we don't need to rush into the superhero stuff. And because it takes its time getting there, it feels all the more like a celebration when Bruce finally shows up as Batman. Its grounded take on Gotham applies to everything, not just the city itself. Batman's gadgets are less sci-fi than they were in prior films. The Batmobile isn't a rocket-powered supercar, it's a military-grade tank painted black. The cast all do a great job. Cillian Murphy in particular stands out to me as Jonathan Crane. He's so unhinged and uncomfortable to be around that I'm surprised he needed his fear-toxin at all. If I'm going to nitpick, I'd say that the film runs a little too long maybe. Not by a lot, but 15 minutes could have been trimmed out of this thing to make it a little tighter. It's hard to complain about, but this is a good film. It just happens to fall back based on the fact that the sequel did everything this did well, but even better. Memento is just a super fun movie to watch. It runs at a really tight 1 hour 53 minutes and is Nolan's second movie ever, which is crazy to me. It's handled so well, you'd swear that a director with decades of experience was helming the thing. The basic story follows Leonard Shelby, a man who's out for revenge on the people who killed his wife. The catch is that Leonard suffers from anterograde amnesia, meaning that he's incapable of making new memories, causing him to essentially reset every 10-15 minutes or so. In order to keep up with his investigation, he takes Polaroids and writes notes for himself, even tattooing some on his body, so when he forgets, he still has the information to hand. It's a really interesting idea that we hadn't really seen done before, but the gimmick of the movie is that it alternates between color and black and white scenes. The black and white scenes play forward chronologically, where the color sequences keep jumping back further into the timeline. Like with Following, it does a good job of keeping certain pieces to the puzzle from you for an added mystery, but it also puts you into Leonard's shoes since you might jump straight into an action sequence with no idea how he got there, and you'll have to keep watching until the next color scene explains it. Joe Pantoliano is really good in this one as Teddy, Leonard's friend who we're not quite sure if we can trust or not. He has a friendly demeanor but always comes across a little slimy in a way that I can't really describe, but you know it when you feel it. There's also a couple twists at the end. One of them is a genuinely impactful surprise that reframes the entire narrative, and the other is a little pointless to me. You'll likely know what I'm talking about if you've seen the film, but I won't go into details now for spoiler's sake. Just know that overall, I think the ending is really well crafted and makes a second viewing all the more interesting. Honestly, whether or not this comes higher than Memento depends on the day you ask me, and today, it just happened to land this way. Interstellar feels like Nolan's most expensive movie, even though it isn't, purely based on how grand and epic the entire atmosphere of this movie is. The visuals are, for my money, Nolan's most breathtaking and awe-inspiring to date, with its depiction of a dying Earth, unknown planets, and the deep reaches of infinite space. And to marry with the incredible sights, the audio is just as expertly engineered to convey the limitless scope that the characters have to travel through. They clearly know when to make things loud, and when to drop things down into complete silence, and allow for the visuals alone to tell the story. The plot follows Joseph Cooper, an ex-NASA pilot who works as a farmer in 2067. Humanity is at risk of extinction due to global famine that is causing the crops to die, so Cooper is brought back by NASA to travel through a wormhole found near Saturn and look for a new planet for mankind to inhabit. It sounds like a fairly basic storyline when compared to Nolan's other work, but I think Interstellar's success comes from its execution over its concept. Due to their proximity to a black hole, time begins to move differently for the team, resulting in Cooper's kids aging faster than he does. So the next time he sees his daughter in a video log, she's 23 years older than she was when he left. Matthew McConaughey's acting is genuinely a career highlight here, with him conveying every sense of sadness, guilt, regret, and pride in a single moment. Hans Zimmer's score is also incredible here. Despite its overuse in TikTok culture lately, it's so minimalistic in its composition that it's beautifully able to capture a high-tech, expansive yet melancholy feel to it. I know some people have gripes with the ending and how everything wraps up, but I genuinely adore it. I think it does a great job of tying up loose ends while leaving just the right things open-ended and up to interpretation. Until the release of Oppenheimer this year, Interstellar was Nolan's longest film to date, but it never really feels like it. Every moment in here feels integral to the story, and it all builds up into an epic, cinematic masterpiece. Here we go, the new kid on the block. I think Oppenheimer is undoubtedly a film intended for mature audiences, but not necessarily for the reasons you'd think. Not because of the harrowing subject matter, not because of the language or the nudity, but because this is mostly a 3-hour story of people just talking in different rooms. Despite being well respected amongst film fans, Nolan has always made relatively accessible films in the guise of the summer blockbuster, with movies like Inception and Tenet. Luckily, Oppenheimer doesn't fall into the trap of leaning too far into the casual market that it loses its potency and rawness. We spend very little time in the grand scheme of things focusing on the atomic bomb, which is likely to trigger a certain demographic of viewers, but the story that was actually spun to us is infinitely more interesting. The cast here are all fantastic at pulling you into the narrative, like Matt Damon and especially Robert Downey Jr. But it's Cillian Murphy's performance that achieves the near impossible and manages to capture every ounce of conflict in J. Robert Oppenheimer's head. He single-handedly had to not only portray the man's eagerness and enthusiasm for the science, but also carry the weight of knowing his greatest contribution to the world was a weapon that could destroy it. The film also cuts back and forth between color and black and white sequences. The distinction between the two isn't immediately apparent, but towards the end you'll piece together that the black and white is a more clinically objective viewpoint on what happened, where the colored sequences are focused more from Oppenheimer's own perspective, where he naturally sees himself as a more sympathetic element to the story. It's these details that make Nolan a master of his craft. He's still using the techniques he practiced in Following and Memento, but has fine-tuned them to work at their most efficient, where they contribute to the story being told instead of serving as a marketable gimmick. I don't think the experience was quite perfect though. I thought that Kitty's change into an alcoholic mother who neglects her kids was quite abrupt. I know the film is very quickly paced and it jumps through time quite consistently, but the alteration to her personality was a little jarring to me. With all that in mind though, Oppenheimer is undoubtedly a crowning achievement, not just for Christopher Nolan and co, but the entire film industry. There aren't many films like this being made these days, and when you get to experience something this well made in IMAX, in a cinema, it makes you fall in love with the art form all over again. The Dark Knight is a film that I find constantly sliding around in my ranking. I totally acknowledge that, objectively speaking, this might be Nolan's most well-crafted movie, but from a personal enjoyment level, I've always found it to be a little overrated. I still really like it, it's number 3 on this list for God's sake, but I don't subscribe to the opinion that it's one of the best movies ever made. Take that, IMDb Top 250. The Dark Knight took everything that Batman Begins did well and somehow managed to improve on it. The actors have upped their game. Now that we have Bruce Wayne established as a character, we're able to explore other people more closely. The action is more intense, and the villains are significantly stronger than the first films. You've got Two-Face, who you've learned to love throughout the first two acts as the people's spokesperson Harvey Dent, and when he eventually flips, it's all the more devastating. And you've got Heath Ledger's Joker, still considered by most to be the best portrayal of the character in over 60 years. He brought such an unexpected and unpredictable chaos to the role that even Michael Caine was scared of him on set. The opening of the film is probably one of the strongest intro sequences to any film ever, with the Joker and his crew attempting a bank heist in Gotham. The middle section of the movie is largely taken up by talk of crime and politics, which sounds dull but is actually really engaging, especially for how it comes into play later. And the finale is epic in scale, while remaining grounded, which I think is something that The Dark Knight Rises lost along the way. This is a film that ups the stakes, not just for Gotham City, but for the characters inhabiting it. Joker pushes Batman to his very limits. Despite not having as close a relationship with him as Ra's al Ghul did, he very nearly causes Bruce to abandon his principles for fear of letting him go to kill again. The Dark Knight is just a super strong movie from start to finish. It's the best of Nolan's Batman trilogy, and at the moment sits in the top 3 of his overall filmography for me. I think that The Prestige might be Nolan's most underrated film. I suppose you could argue that Insomnia slips under the radar more often, but on a scale of quality versus popularity, this easily takes the cake for me. This is the story of two magicians who begin a friendly competition to continually one-up each other, but it soon escalates into an increasingly obsessive rivalry that continues to grow to the detriment of everyone around them. It sounds a little weird, but it's as mind-bogglingly captivating as it is thought-provoking from a narrative sense. The film opens and closes with the same monologue about the 3-act structure of a magic trick. The Pledge, where we're shown something ordinary, The Turn, where something incredible is done with it, and The Prestige, where the performer has to bring things full circle and go out with a bang. The genius move that Nolan managed to pull off is structuring his movie around that very same premise. The Prestige is split into 3 identifiable sections, each representing one of those steps. Everybody knows that 90% of magic tricks are done through misdirection, subconsciously placing the audience's attention elsewhere so that the trick can be performed in front of our very eyes. Nolan makes use of these commonplace tactics in that very same way. There are a few reveals that we never see coming because we're always focusing on the wrong thing. We have 2 different narrators in the film, neither are all that reliable as storytellers, and the chronology of the timeline is orchestrated to deceive us. You never really know anybody's intentions, where their loyalties lie, or who is even right or wrong. It's a clever way of giving a wink to the audience and letting them in on the process of constructing a film like this, while also making it way more interesting on a rewatch. I think it takes a special kind of film to do that, and The Prestige definitely fits the bill. You've also got to respect the absolutely bonkers decision to cast David Bowie as Nikola Tesla. How amazing is that? Okay, so I'm not exactly happy about this being my number 1. It's practically a cliche and reveals my inner film bro, but I can't help it. There's just something about Inception that works for me. I think it's a super fun time throughout the whole thing, it's emotional when it needs to be, and that ending still hits every single time. I'm just in love with everything here, from the general premise on the page to the execution on screen. So it's about a professional thief who steals information by infiltrating the subconscious minds of his targets, and one day he's given a job to do the opposite and plant an idea instead. What an amazing idea for a story, and this only gets heightened when you take into account the other factors like time gradually slowing down as they enter dreams within dreams, or the protagonist's subconscious projection of his wife. There's so much to chew on here. The cast are all fantastic, especially Leonardo DiCaprio and Cillian Murphy. The range of emotions that they both portray through facial expressions and vocal inflections are honestly incredible. Also, Hans Zimmer's score is perfect for the tone of the film, with Time being one of my favourite musical compositions for any movie ever. But what I think makes Inception so universally appealing is that it handles mature themes and ideas while still being easily digestible to a casual audience. The topic of domestic abuse, suicide, and mental illness is explored, but the film never fails to be fun. It's an assault on the senses and will always satiate your appetite for creative visual stimulation. I don't know what I can say that hasn't already been said ad nauseum, but this is far and above my favourite of Christopher Nolan's movies, and one of my favourite movies of all time. And that's my list. Let me know what you think of my ranking, and be sure to pop your ranking down below so I can check them out. As funny as it is to make fun of Nolan fans for being basic film bros, it's hard to deny that the man makes great movies. Sure, not every single one of them is a hit for me, but he has made some of my favourite movies ever, and I'm always looking forward to what he's doing next. Thank you all very much for watching. Be sure to follow me on Letterboxd, link in the description, to keep up with what I'm watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.